Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Bronfman, and as chair of the AJC's Board of Trustees, I'm delighted to welcome you to this AJC concurrent session, Israel One-on-One, a conversation with Ambassador Ron Dermer. Ambassador Dermer told Prime Minister Netanyahu in their first meeting in the year 2000 that when other recent Israeli leaders had been at the helm, there had been quiet in the office and chaos in the country. But with Mr. Netanyahu in charge, Mr. Dermer observed, there was chaos in the Prime Minister's office, but at least, thank God, there was quiet in the country. Since that first meeting, Ambassador Dermer has been one of Mr. Netanyahu's closest advisors, as well as a tireless and eloquent advocate, not only for Israel, but also for the unshakable alliance between Israel and the United States. Born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida, Ambassador Dermer's first job in Israeli politics began while he was still studying at Oxford. In between academic terms, he helped Natan Sharansky launch the Immigrants' Party and prepare for the 1996 Israeli elections. Shortly after his graduation, Ambassador Dermer made Aliyah and became an Israeli citizen. For 3 years, Ambassador Dermer wrote a column for the Jerusalem Post and co-wrote with Mr. Sharansky, quote, The Case for Democracy, a book which argues that the conflict between Israel and Palestinian leadership is not about territory, but about the struggle between free societies and fierce societies, those ruled by tyrants. In 2013, Mr. Netanyahu tapped Ambassador Dermer, then his most senior advisor, to serve as Israel's ambassador to the United States. Having served in his role under 2 U.S. administrations, Ambassador Dermer joins us today, as he's done at previous AJC GLOFOs, to offer an inside look at Israel's relationship with the U.S. and to discuss some of the most pressing issues that Israel and friends of Israel face today. Guiding us in this conversation, of course, is our very own AJC CEO, David Harris. And if I may, before turning the floor over to David, I want to tell a quick story that the ambassador recently told me, that when he was presenting his credentials to President Obama during, obviously, when he just arrived as ambassador, and his wife and his baby daughter Golda were with him, and he observed that it was probably 50 years since a woman named Golda was in the Oval Office. President Obama said, well, this one's younger and prettier. And the ambassador observed, well, Mr. President, that's a low bar. Anyway.
It's all right, it's all right.
David, the floor is yours.
After that? What can I possibly say other than change the subject? So thank you, Matthew, and I think the standing room crowd only speaks for itself, Ron. So let me begin by asking you.
It means you got a very small room, is what it means.
By my count, this is our 5th time doing this one-on-one since Ron became ambassador. We skipped last year because we were in Jerusalem. So my opening question is a very difficult question that I hope you'll be able to answer. Has anything changed since 2 years ago?
Well, let's see. Since we were here, when was it?
2017.
2017. So let's talk about a few things that have changed. The United States has withdrawn from the nuclear deal with Iran. The United States has restored sanctions against Iran. The United States has designated the IRGC a foreign terrorist organization. The United States has recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The United States has moved its embassy to Jerusalem. The United States has recognized the Golan Heights as being part of Israel, and the Prime Minister was actually just given the fresh new map from the State Department. And we've seen an upgrade in our relations with the United States across the board on so many issues. So I'd say a few things have changed since we met 2 years ago, and I would say almost all of them for the better.
So, Ron, the sub-theme of this AJC Global Forum is capturing the zeitgeist. And one of the issues that's on the minds of many of us is all of those things are terrific, but has there been any domestic cost? Is there a growing divide between Democrats and Republicans? Is that overblown? How should we interpret the current mood here in Washington?
So we'll just put all that good news to the side, and now we can talk about
We're
it.
Jews.
You know, the Jews have a unique capacity at seeing the glass as 1/16 empty. Okay?
Actually, I have to edit the word unique. I believe William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet, once said, "The Irish are comforted by the knowledge that even in moments of great happiness, tragedy lurks just around the corner."
Actually, I thought that was only a Jewish thing. So the day before the opening of the embassy,
We'll get back to the subject matter.
we will get to the subject matter, I promise. But the day before the opening of the embassy, I was in Jerusalem, and how many of you were here that weekend that the embassy was open in Jerusalem? Anybody?
In Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem. How many of you were in Jerusalem the weekend that the embassy was open? So very, very few. But there are some, I know there's some Israeli journalists here and some Israelis here. And I have to tell you, I moved to Israel in 1996. I can't remember a day like that. The only thing close to it actually was the day Gilad Shalit was released, where there was a sense that the country was a few feet taller. And It was a remarkable moment. And I was in the King David Hotel, and I ran into Pastor Hagee, who spoke at the opening.
Right.
And, you know, he's the founder of Kufi, Christians United for Israel. And there was just such a sense of elation. And I said to him, let me ask you, Pastor, is it only with Jews that when things are going so well that we think that something bad is about to happen? And he says, yeah, it's pretty much just with Jews. So apparently it's the Irish as well. First, look, before we talk about the issues of bipartisan support for Israel and everything, I want people to understand something. I believe that Israel will be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century. And I'm not saying that because of all the good things that have happened in the last 2 years or under this administration. I said that in the first speech I gave as a sitting Israeli ambassador in 2014 under the previous administration, when we had a disagreement over the Iran nuclear deal, which they had already signed an interim agreement, when we had a disagreement over the best way to advance peace with the Palestinians. And the reason why I believe Israel is going to be the most important ally is for two reasons: security and technology. Now, here's a question for all of you. If you are the President of the United States and you have to pick one country in the world to choose as your security partner for the next 50 years, who is it going to be? Now, when you're thinking about that, think about where the threats are going to be emanating from for the next half century or so, at least for the next few decades. Think about a country that has a powerful military where you won't have to send your sons and daughters and put boots on the ground to defend her. Think about a country with a powerful and first-class intelligence agency that can not only provide intelligence to protect its own country, but can pass intelligence to you to help keep your people safe and keep your allies safe. Think about cyber, a country with a serious cyber capability, because we're going into a world where more and more of those threats are happening in cyberspace. And who are you going to choose? And if people are really honest about it, beyond the disagreement about this or that policy between governments, there's really only two countries: Britain and Israel. Those are the two that are left when you just think about security. Now think to yourself, if you could choose one technology partner over the next 50 years, when you're thinking not only about the remarkable technologies in agriculture, in water, cyber is another area, but all these technologies of the future, autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence. You know, Israel, as you know, we sent a craft to the moon. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Israel landed on the moon. We crash landed, but we landed.
Small detail.
Let me tell you, if that horse at the Belmont finishes and drops right after and they finish first, he won. We landed on the moon. So we'll have a soft landing eventually. But think about it.
2 years.
What are the countries that have done that? You know, U.S., Russia, China, Israel. You are in a very, very elite group. And when it comes to technology, who are your allies on that short list? It's Israel. So Israel will be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century. I am supremely confident about it, regardless of this or that disagreement we may have with different governments in Israel or different governments in the United States. Now you asked me a question about gaps. So I had somebody visit me about a year ago. And it was right after the opening of the embassy, and there was concern at the time about there weren't members of Congress, particularly Democratic members of Congress, who were there. And actually no one was invited there. Some congressmen just came, but they happened to be all Republicans who came. But there was concern about ensuring that Israel maintained strong bipartisan support. And there's no question that strong bipartisan support is a strategic interest of Israel. And I showed this person who is Democrat, who is working to strengthen support for Israel within the Democratic Party, I showed him a poll. And the poll, the headline was, huge gap in partisan support for Israel, huge gap between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to support for Israel. And I asked him, what do you think the reasons for this gap are? And he thought about it, and he said, well, the Prime Minister's speech to Congress in 2015. He said there was a lot of conflict with the previous administration. And he said there's also the embrace of this administration, and even though they're doing positive things, it has blowback in certain quarters because people who don't like the president for other things. So he gave me all of these lists, and I said, that's a really interesting theory. Now look at the date on the poll that I just gave you, and it was 2003. You know, we process information through narratives. That's how we filter this, and we do it more and more because we're inundated by so much information that if it doesn't fit into a narrative, we can't even remember it. So here's something that probably, maybe no one in this room knows. There is a 40-year gap of support between Republicans and Democrats on Israel. 40 years, not 4, not 10, 40 years, since 1988 when Gallup has been doing this poll year after year after year. There's a gap. Now, the gap has grown from about 20% to 30% in the first 2 decades to about 45% today. Right now, the gap is not at an all-time high. The all-time high actually happened in 1991 during the first Gulf War. That was the largest gap ever measured between Republicans and Democrats when it came to support for Israel. Now, most of the increase in the gap is not coming from a decline in support among Democrats. It's actually coming from an atmospheric rise in support among Republicans for Israel, where the numbers sort of shot up. So when, it's like those, I guess it was the Gomer Pyle. I don't know if
Gomer Pyle.
I'm probably even dating you there. So I remember Gomer Pyle.
That would be hard.
But you know how everybody would stand in line, and so one person takes a step back and you're already ahead. So even if the Democrats are in the same level of support for Israel, if you have that stratospheric rise, that's going to account for a lot. What I think has happened after looking at the data, and I think about this issue a lot because I think it's an important thing that Israel has to focus on ensuring it has strong support on both sides of the aisle. And we have, and I think we will. But here is the issue. When I see a spike in 1991, and then you see for the last, really since 2001, an increase in support that has stayed very, very high for Israel among the American public with this large gap between the parties, what you see is what happened is the first Gulf War and September 11th were what I would call we or you or us moments in the political debate. I think the center-right side of the American political spectrum saw Israel as we or you or us. Mm-hmm. We were facing the same enemies. We are confronting the same challenges. Now, I believe that on the center-left side of the spectrum, we are you and you are us. I think Israel is the only source for progressive values in the Middle East. It's the only place where you have real rights for women, real rights for minority. They say Israel has the largest gay pride parade in the Middle East. Talk about a low bar. So I believe that moment can come, and what Israel has to do is continue to engage, continue to reach out. You do that at AJC very, very effectively. Continue to tell the story about Israel. You know, what struck me about the poll, and I just saw it on my way here, that your poll, was that nearly 60% of American Jews have never been to Israel.
Right.
60%. So now think about non-Jews. And think about that the story they see is only a story through the mainstream media. And let's just say they haven't been kind to Israel in the last few years. There is one issue that I would, and I know this is a short answer to a long question, but I want to just make one point that does concern me. It does concern me, and it's part of the, it's on the extremes, but it could easily find its way in the mainstream. What concerns me is this. The Jews made many contributions to ideas, religious ideas, throughout history. But if I could sum up our contribution to political ideas, it was this. We rejected the idea that might makes right. We rejected it from the pharaohs, from the Caesars, and certainly from a Fuhrer. The problem that I see today is many young people talk about a zeitgeist. Many young people believe that might makes wrong. And that's dangerous for Israel. It's also very un-Jewish in my view, because in our world, might is might and right is right. You can be strong and just, you can be strong and unjust. You can be weak and just, you can be weak and unjust. But in a world where might makes wrong, and a lot of people coming out of university systems, that's what they see. And as Israel rises as a power among the nations, and we are rising as a power. Israel was ranked 8th most powerful country in the world. Think about it, 71 years old, the size of New Jersey with 9 million citizens, and we are ranked the 8th most powerful country in the world. I think that's wonderful, and it's great for our relations and everything else. But the challenge is if people believe might makes wrong, that's a problem. And so you have to work through this, and I hope the American Jewish community also here will understand it's not just a danger for Israel. It's a danger for Jews in the United States. A world where might makes wrong is not going to be a safe world for the American Jewish community, because you are not a weak community anymore. We're not where our grandparents and great-grandparents were. And it's a wrong idea, and just as we fought a world that believed might makes right, we should fight a world that believes might makes wrong.
So I want to see how this group mirrors or doesn't the AJC poll. You're about 400 people in this room. How many of you have been to Israel? Ron Prosor has never been to Israel. That's news.
He's too busy doing a great job representing us around the world.
Let's tweet
How about
that.
a hand for Ron? And two Rons don't make a right. Just remember that.
I think he has this script down already. For those of you who may not know, because this is really inside the Beltway, Ron Prosor, among other posts, was the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He was the Israeli ambassador to the UK. He was the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And most importantly, he's my friend. And a great asset. And sitting next to him, by the way, is Benji Krasna, who we first met as the Deputy Consul General of Israel in New York, and who over several posts is now what's called the Deputy Chief of Mission, in other words, the Deputy Ambassador of Israel here in its most important embassy in the world. So Benji, welcome to you. So back to my question. How many of you...
By the way, I'm sorry, it would be very interesting if you take out from your poll people who've been to Israel and run all those
Absolutely.
numbers with people who've been to Israel, and you could see the dramatic change that will have in views, I think, about a lot of issues.
How many of you in this room have been to Israel more than 5 times? How many of you have been more than 10 times? Well over half. How many of you have...
Keep going. I want to see who's left. We'll get the toaster on the way out. 20 times? 20 times? 20 times? 50 times. Sold to the man in the back.
Wait a second, I raised my hand. Actually, we have some ringers like the Liebers who have a home in Israel. So we have a number of people who've lived, studied, worked. So this is not exactly your typical slice of American Jewry. But let me ask you, Ron, back to the theme of Israel as a progressive cause. Because for our advocacy, it's extremely important that our audience hear the case to be made for Israel as a progressive cause. When you go to the Hill, for example, and you meet with members of the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party or people who align with those views, share with us what are the concerns you hear from them and how do you reply to them?
Well, I would say that most of the concerns actually focus on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which less so in the last couple of years, but before that became really a focus of the U.S.-Israel relations in a way that, look, it's an important issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and we should work to resolve the conflict and achieve peace. But as I said, Israel is going to be, in my view, the most important ally of the United States for the 21st century. So it should not be an issue that simply dominates the conversation between Israel and the United States. It's not in Israel's interest, and I don't think it's in America's interest, because Israel is, like I said, is helping the U.S. in deep and fundamental ways in a way that was not true even 2 decades ago. But they have concerns on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and here you see a difference definitely between the parties in the United States. And you explain to them, the context of the decision-making within Israel, that Israel has constantly tried to reach out and make peace with the Palestinians. You inform them of the history, because a lot of people don't know the basic facts. I mean, as I said, you're living in a world of narratives and images, and in a world where Israel is strong and the Palestinians are perceived to be weak. For a lot of people, that just ends the conversation. Doesn't matter agency or anything else. You see it in the time of a conflict that flares up. I mean, we've had a number of little rounds within Gaza, but the last time we had a major round, you had all these rockets in 50 days, thousands of rockets, and then you have people who were killed on the other side. And so for some people, it's just a question of, how many people are dying on both sides. I'm not interested in who's responsible, who's not, that Palestinians use their own people as human shields, all the issues that people who follow this issue know. Most people are getting their information by just turning on CNN or reading the New York Times or something like that. And when you have an effort, and here I think the New York Times has done a good job of this, at demonizing Israel, week after week after week after, no, I think it's a serious problem. I think it's a serious problem because it requires, look, you just had when that cartoon was published about a month ago, and the New York Times, they wrote, hey, only one person saw it, and so it kind of slipped through the cracks. And then there was an editorial the next day that was actually the best editorial probably written in the New York Times for 20 years, which is another very low bar. But they said there in the Times that we've always been stalwart supporters of Israel.
That was their word, stalwart.
Really? Really? And when you demonize Israel, when you take all of these marginal phenomena in our society and you put them on the front page, over time, it starts affecting people's view. And that's a decision of editors. Look, some editor there decided during the nuclear deal debate, which you remember, to put a yellow, to highlight in yellow the Jewish members of Congress who had decided to oppose the nuclear deal with Iran. How many editors saw that? Was that one person who was on the night desk? There is an attempt and a consistent effort to demonize the Jewish state. And what disturbs me, and this is important for how it affects the broader American society, people who demonize the Jewish state to believe that that's not going to lead also to the spread of anti-Semitism, they're kidding themselves. Because Israel, for better or for worse, has become the world's Jew. So if you're going to cast Israel as this demon week after week after week after week after week and think that that's not going to have any impact on the broader culture, you're kidding themselves. And though that's a paper that editorializes and calls on political leaders to be careful with their rhetoric, because even if you're not directly, you're contributing to a climate where bad things can happen, well, they should look in the mirror. That New York Times editorial board should look in the mirror and say, have you contributed to a climate that is demonizing the Jewish state and thereby demonizing the Jewish people?
So, Ron, again, having a sense of what some people in the room are feeling, we've been showing a series of videos by presidential candidates. We asked every presidential candidate if they would share a customized video with AJC, And since yesterday, we've been showing one after another, after a third. We have most of the leading candidates. And several of them have said very explicitly, including Kamala Harris this morning, I think, the only solution to the conflict is 2 states for 2 peoples. I'm sure you hear this regularly in your meetings in Congress. How, at this moment in time, do you respond to that point when it's made from a member of Congress?
Well, let me ask the question. I don't want to put this audience on the spot, but since you've been raising your hands, how many people here support a 2-state solution? Okay, so almost everybody. Okay, now,
it's about 2/3.
How many people here think that the Palestinians should have an army? No. How many people here think that the Palestinians should control their airspace? How many people here think that the Palestinians should have full control at their borders and they can determine whatever weapons they want to bring into the country? No. How many people here think the Palestinians should be able to make military pacts with a country like Iran? No. So you see, what you're saying here is something that is not consistent with full sovereignty. So when people, and I think this is part of the problem that you have, the 2-state versus not 2-state has become a litmus test for things that really nobody means. The substance is very simple, and this is a substance that the Prime Minister himself said. I want the Palestinians to have all the powers to govern themselves, but none of the powers to threaten Israel. How many people agree with that? Right. So what you have to do is you have to negotiate a solution that actually affects that outcome, that can bring about that outcome. And that is very hard, because if people say, 2 states, you're flying into unlimited sovereignty. Now, in Israel, the number of people who actually for 1 state is very, very small. And I actually believe that this is one of those issues, I don't want to say it's a red herring, but within Israeli politics, I think there is a very broad consensus, about 80%, that would agree to what I just said. Give them all the powers to govern themselves, but none of the powers that could threaten Israel. That is the position of the Prime Minister. And that is exactly what he would try to achieve in any negotiations with them. And so you talk about issues like self-determination, you talk about a flag, you talk about running their own lives. I think the vast majority of the people in Israel don't have a problem with that. What they're worried about is all these powers of sovereignty that could threaten them. And this is not a minor point. We're not a thought experiment on a whiteboard at the State Department or in a foreign ministry somewhere. We're a country of 9 million people. And in order for the Prime Minister to get the outcome he wants, for him to, get hit by a few op-eds, we'll take it, because we have no other choice. We have to have a political solution with the Palestinians that would enable them to govern themselves and not threaten us. That's what we want to achieve, and that's what we hope we will achieve when finally the Trump administration can release their plan, which hopefully will happen sometime this century.
And by the way, to this point, those of you who were in the plenary session and heard the interview with Prime Minister Netanyahu, when asked the question, what are the essential Israeli negotiating positions in the deal of the century, the first and foremost point he made was Israel must have complete security authority west of the Jordan River. And that's the point he dwelled on. So it's very much
and to understand that this is a very practical issue. Look, we wasted, I think, 8 years with the previous administration not even beginning this conversation. Because if people are going to think that Israel is going to walk out, Israel's security services will walk out of Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, and that's a discussion, we're not going to get anywhere, because it's not going to happen. We left Lebanon, we went back to the international border, we got an Iranian terror base, forward terror base on our northern border, which has presented a real strategic threat to Israel. We left Gaza, we did exactly what the international community says, uprooted all the settlements, disinterred people from their graves, went to the 67 border. Now we got another forward terror position against us, thousands of rockets fired on us. It's not going to happen. Israel's not going to walk out and simply hope for the best. And it can't be, well, you'll have 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. It's not going to happen. I'm telling you, the people of Israel will not commit suicide. It's not going to happen. And what the conversation should have been for the last decade was a very different conversation, which would be a reasonable conversation to have, which is not how many years until you leave. It's saying, how do you stay in a way that minimizes the friction between the Palestinians and allows them to have this independent existence, however you want to call it, and not have constant friction with Israel's security services? That's an interesting question. How do you affect it? How do you minimize the visible footprint that you would have while maintaining your security? It's an interesting conversation to have, but when the conversation becomes whether it's 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years and Israel's going to leave, you can't get anywhere. And the idea is, again, unlimited sovereignty. There was a time when the idea of Israel maintaining security control came up about a decade ago. And the Palestinian response was that it would make the Palestine a Mickey Mouse state. That's what was said. You know, Japan has U.S. forces for 75 years. Germany, U.S. forces, 75 years. And if anyone thinks that was by agreement at the beginning, they're kidding themselves. It was imposed. Then they understood it was good for them. And over time, there was a mutual interest in keeping it. But you have that same thing in South Korea, and it has helped stabilize the peace. Our situation is different than America's situation. This is not a threat thousands of miles away. This is right next door. So Israel's security service, Israel's military is going to have security control west of the Jordan River, period. And the conversation has to be, how do we do that in a way that minimizes friction and minimizes the footprint to enable them to have the type of life they want to have?
I have 100 questions, but I'm only going to ask one more because we're then going to turn, Ron, with your okay, as we have in the past, to the audience. And I'll hold my breath, hoping there are questions and not long editorials on what Israel should or should not do. So please get your questions ready. And we have microphones. We have one on this side, and we have one on this side. And just so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the microphones. Ron, you have been particularly focused and passionate on the Iran issue as long as I've known you. And as you mentioned, the administration withdrew completely from the JCPOA. Sanctions have been ratcheted up in a way that's unprecedented and continuing to tighten the noose. How do you see this unfolding from your perspective in the coming months, number one? And number two, again, I have to ask you, returning to the zeitgeist, several Democratic presidential candidates are on record saying that if elected, they would return the United States to the JCPOA. Do you take that threat seriously? Do you think there's a way to derail or forestall it from your perspective, should there be a new outcome in 2020?
Well, look, I hope that those candidates will reconsider because it would be very dangerous for the state of Israel. I want to explain, as we forget things so quickly, why Israel opposed the nuclear deal with Iran. If there were a deal on the table that would actually block Iran's path to a bomb, I would have gone house to house in this country to convince people to support it. The reason why we opposed it was because that is not what the deal does. And the statements at the time that this did block Iran's path to a bomb were simply untrue. Had somebody said, we think this deal provides 10 or 15 years where it's unlikely that they're going to break to the bomb, that would have been a true statement. But the danger in the deal is all the restraints that were put in place in this deal are automatically removed in 10 to 15 years, which seems like a long time in the life of politics, and it is, but it's a blink of an eye in the life of a country. And our concern was that when this deal is in place, Iran, all they have to do is wait. They don't have to change their behavior. They just wait. And we're already 4 years beyond it. So it's not 10 to 15. Now it's 6 to 11. And the time will move very, very quickly. And Iran will not have to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They just walk into the nuclear club. That's what the deal does. And that's why the Prime Minister opposed it. And understand, Iran is advancing its nuclear weapons program today. It is advancing its nuclear weapons program today. If you think the deal froze it, you're wrong. Because Iran is doing research and development on advanced centrifuges. They're working to develop.
Which is permitted under the deal.
Which is permitted, yeah. There's the greatest line in this 130-something page document, if I recall, was that Iran can only do research on the IR-2, 4, 6, and 8 over the next decade. Now, IR-2, 4, 6, and 8, those are second generation, fourth generation, sixth generation, eighth generation centrifuges. That's like telling Apple that over the next decade, they can only do research on the iPhone 12, 13, 14, and 15. It's funny, but it's a real deal. It actually is funny. But what Iran had to do on this deal for its nuclear program was mothball the iPhone 3 while it continues to work on new iPhones under the deal. And it gets its ballistic missile program, and it starts advancing it. And we know from the nuclear archive that they were much more advanced in weaponization than anybody thought. So they just, in 2030, when all the restraints were removed, they just walk into it and they put all the elements in place. That's why this deal was a disaster. In addition to that, it created another problem, which is by removing the sanctions, it created a tailwind of a huge inflow of cash into Iranian coffers, many, many tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. You remember that the debate if it was $50 billion or $100 billion, that was the signing bonus of the deal. That was the small money. That was Iranian money that was parked in foreign bank accounts, money from their sales of oil that was parked in accounts that they could repatriate to Iran. The big money in the deal is the ability to export oil. Iran was exporting, about a year ago, nearly 3 million barrels of oil a day, about 2.8 million barrels a day. Now, what's the price of oil this morning? 65, 70. Okay, so they were almost at 3. This month, a 500,000 barrels a day. So it's a difference of over 2 million barrels a day. Now, at $65, that's $130 million a day, which is $4 billion a month, which is $50 billion a year, which over 10 or 15 years is $500 to $750 billion. Now, I'd like to believe that all that money that starts flowing into Iran's coffers would go to establishing a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. But instead, all it did was fuel Iran's war machine in the Middle East and creating acute threats to Israel's security. You know, you had the issue in the last couple of weeks where Iran was trying to flex its muscles and doing all sorts of things by proxy and otherwise. And people said, wow, this is endangering. President Trump's actions are endangering the Middle East. Where have you been the last 3 or 4 years? Iran is everywhere, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, in Iraq, everywhere, attacking everybody. And what happened with the decision of President Trump is he pulls out of the deal, which, as I said, is a glide path to a nuclear arsenal, and then by restoring sanctions, you turn a tailwind into a headwind. And you remember a year ago, people said, if the United States leaves by itself, it will never be able to actually have the massive sanctions regime. Why were the sanctions so effective? People were probably here a year, not here, in Jerusalem, telling you, well, if America goes by itself, it's never going to be able to have the strong sanctions that we had under the previous administration because then we got the whole world on board. Nonsense. There was only one question. Would the United States use its economic power to make countries choose between doing business with a $400 billion Iranian economy or a $21, $22 trillion U.S. economy? That was the question, and it's always been the question. And the answer with this administration was yes. And because they did that, they have now forced a dramatic change, which has been essential for Israel's security. And I've said it publicly many times. I will say it again here. The decision of President Trump to withdraw from the nuclear deal and to restore U.S. sanctions is the single most important decision ever made by an American president for Israel's national security. Ever. Now, what does it mean in terms of your question? What it means, I was just setting up the answer. What does it mean for your question? You're going to return to the same exact deal? What does that mean? To return to the same deal, which I don't understand at all, because the U.S. has huge leverage right now that's been created by what President Trump has done. But to return to the deal would be returning to the same path that leads to nuclear weapons. We were on cruise control heading off a cliff. And everyone says the deal was working. It's like saying the cruise control is working as we get closer and closer to the cliff. And Trump turns it this way. Now somebody's saying, no, I want to go right back to the cruise control, right towards the cliff. And you're going to now remove the sanctions, which are going to give hundreds of billions of dollars to an avowed enemy of Israel that wants to wage war against us. Right now, Iran, as I said, is facing the headwinds. Right now, the fuel of that war machine is drying up. Why would you possibly want to go back into the deal. It is dangerous for Israel. It is dangerous for our Arab neighbors. So you have leaders in Europe, the Foreign Minister Mogherini, who says this deal made the Middle East safer. We live in the Middle East. We're the guinea pigs of this failed experiment. But they're going to tell us, the French, the Germans, your allies, are telling you to go back into the deal. Israel's an ally of the United States. Some of our Arab neighbors are allies of the United States. We live in the region. Listen to us. One difference between this deal and what happened in the case of North Korea, which I think is an important moral difference to keep in mind. When you had six-party talks with North Korea, two of those six parties, the Japanese and the South Koreans, they were at the negotiating table. And Japan and South Korea were practically begging both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration to do deals with North Korea. Now, I think that has to count for something. Morally, it has to count for something. If your allies who have the most skin in the game are telling you to do a deal, you have to have a pretty good reason to overlook that and to turn against those countries that are going to actually be on the front lines. In the case of the nuclear deal with Iran, Israel was not there. The Arab states were not there. We both opposed it. They did not say so publicly. The Prime Minister of Israel had the courage to say publicly what everybody in the region thought when he came and he spoke in Congress. And we were not at the negotiating table. And somebody told me a long time ago, if you're not sitting around the table, you're probably on the menu. And Israel, so the bottom line is this.
Certainly in the Middle East.
I hope that all of these candidates will not get locked into a political position. I don't think they've studied the whole issue. I don't think they've had all the briefings, which makes, I think, the job of organizations like this even more important. Tell them the facts. There were a lot of hopes in 2015. There were a lot of question marks about what would be. Now we're living in exclamation points. We know what happened. Let's not go back to the same failed experiment. Let's do something else. They don't necessarily have to have the same position as the current administration. But to go back to the same deal would be a danger, a fundamental danger to Israel, and I hope they will reconsider, and we'll see what happens. It makes my job that much harder, and it makes your job that much harder and that much more important.
Okay. It's now your turn, and what we'll do, Ron, is if you want to take some notes, we'll collect a few questions. I see the gentleman in the back right there, Michael. I can't see a face. I just see a couple of hands.
David, it's Stuart Sloan from Los Angeles.
Okay.
How you doing, David?
I'm fine. Thank you, Stuart.
Good. It's a long way.
We have a lot of questions, so I'd love to get a few quick, concise questions.
Well, my question will be 13 words. I'm very interested in the UN and anti-Israel votes from my organization that I belong to, Ajiri. And my question is, what change has there been in Israel's status in the UN in the last several years?
Okay. And let's stay, Michael, in your neighborhood again. I only see a hand. Is it a lady in the back? Or a gentleman?
Ken Schulman from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mr. Ambassador, with the growth of the Iranian threat, Israel is developing and deepening ties with several of the Gulf states. What must Israel do to be cautious and manage these relationships better towards a more positive end?
Okay, Israel and the Gulf. Stay there, Michael. There's one more question, then we'll move to another part of the room.
Jackson Richmond from Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org. What is your reaction, Ambassador, to Secretary Pompeo reportedly saying last week to the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations that the upcoming Mideast peace plan by the Trump administration may be unexecutable?
You mean an off-the-record meeting
by the way,
with Jewish leaders, something leaked? I'm shocked. I am stunned. I'm stunned.
Okay, take a couple more, Ron. We'll see if they're overlapping themes, because we got a lot of hands here. All right, so we'll take two more here, and then we'll shift to this side. So, Michael, please.
I give very concise answers, so we're going to be able to get to a lot of them. Yeah.
Hi, Paul Epner from Evanston, Illinois. And this is almost really more for you, David, but it's going to fit within all this. I believe, AJC took a very deliberate, slow, thoughtful process to its position originally to reject the original Iranian deal. I believe I heard a year ago that while we were against it originally, we did not agree with pulling out. Clearly, the ambassador has laid out a compelling statement, and I'm wondering if there's either more to the story or if this is the evolving situation, of course, and we're learning new information, and now we would tell candidates we want to stay out.
Very quickly, there's more to the story. Yes, we opposed the original deal. We took 23 days to do so, both because the deal was so complex and also because we wanted to be taken seriously in the debate that followed and not appear to be a knee-jerk, reflexive organization that if we were left-wing would support the deal and if we were right-wing would oppose the deal. And I think that strategy has been borne out. When the president withdrew from the deal, we supported the president's decision, and we have been consistent since the president pulled out of the deal that we support the president, and we've made the case to the Europeans and to those in this country who want to return to the deal. So, but I want to return now to Ron. Last question, Michael, behind you, and then we'll go over to this side.
Hi. First, thanks for your remarks. And
Could you stand up, sir?
yeah, I'm Danny. I come from Rome, and I would have a bunch of questions, but I'm gonna select one only.
Just one, please. We all have a bunch
Yeah.
of questions.
It's about the military control of the western part of the West Bank you were talking about for a Palestinian state. Okay. So first, the notion of state includes the military. So you would have to change the notion of state first before giving the Palestinians a state. Don't you think that it would become a smaller Gaza if you control that area and give the West Bank to Palestinians with Jews living in?
Okay. Ron, did you get those four?
Yeah, so look, the first one, the last question, you have to have a new conception of sovereignty, that it's not unlimited sovereignty. And I think if Israel maintains its security and has the ability to keep any future political entity demilitarized, then I think it's a sustainable solution. If it doesn't, then you're just going to see another Gaza emerge there. And actually dealing with that through negotiations, it sounds easy, but it's actually quite difficult. And you have to shift international public opinion, and maybe we'll see what will happen in the Trump plan when it comes out, whether it actually takes and addresses Israel's fundamental security concerns seriously, because they're not taken seriously by the rest of the world. It's just like there'll be guarantees and maybe there'll be international forces and stuff. And we've seen how that has worked in other theaters. We don't have a Sinai in between us and the Palestinians. A Sinai is about 3 times the size of Israel. So we're living, cheek by jowl, and we have to have a solution that can work. And I think if Israel retains security control, then it's possible to find a solution that can work as long as the Palestinians cross another Rubicon and accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any boundary. That's what the conflict has always been about. Remember, 1947, there were 2 states for 2 peoples, a Jewish state and an Arab state. It wasn't called Palestine at the time. None of the issues that people think are core to the conflict were there. The refugee issue had not happened yet. Jerusalem was an international city, according to that resolution. The issues of the settlements, post-67 settlements, they were going to happen 20 years later. There was a simple question. Do you accept the right of the Jewish people to a nation state in any boundary? In order to achieve a peaceful settlement, you not only are going to have the security conditions on the ground and the security capabilities that you can defend yourself by yourself, they're going to have to cross a Rubicon, okay? And I don't see any evidence yet that the Palestinians are prepared to cross that Rubicon. What I do think is interesting is I think that the Arab states in the region, many of them are prepared to cross that Rubicon. And what I mean by that is if they could wave a magic wand and end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I believe they would. And that was not the case 10 or 15 years ago. There was an Arab Peace Initiative, you may remember, in 2002. That initiative came 7 months after 9/11, and I think the context of why the Saudi leadership at the time wanted to advance it or why there was this Arab Peace Initiative was very different. And I think if you would have really asked them, do you want to see an end? I'm not so sure they would have said yes. I'm being diplomatic. because this conflict has served useful needs of diverting attention from all sorts of internal problems. And people believed up until about 8, 9 years ago, before the Arab Spring, that this is the central problem, not in the Middle East, in the world.
Solve the Middle East.
You remember there was, I think it was General Jones said, if God would appear to President Obama, it's very hard for me to understand the whole analogy, but if he could only give him one piece of advice, he would say, solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, and people were probably sitting on an AJC stage 10 years ago telling you this was the most important and would fundamentally transform the Middle East. Look, in the history, 100-year history of our conflict with the Palestinians, we've had 20,000 people who've been killed on both sides, maybe 22,000. That shocks people when I tell them that. The whole Israeli-Arab conflict is about 125,000. 22,000 of those 125,000 are Israelis and Palestinians. Think about what's happening in Syria. Think about Iraq. Think about Libya. These conflicts have nothing to do with it. You have a battle between the forces of medievalism and modernity. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be solved because we don't want to have to fight wars. We don't want to have to send our children generation after generation. We don't want to deal. We want to solve it for ourselves. But not because it's going to magically transform the Middle East. But what has happened in recent years is the Arab states realize that Israel is not an enemy but a potential ally. And what has caused this moment of opportunity, and I actually do believe it's a moment of opportunity. I'm more optimistic about the chances of reconciliation between Israel and the broader Arab world than I have ever been. And I opposed Oslo. I wrote about it at the time. I opposed the disengagement. I wrote about it at the time. But I actually think we have a window of opportunity because of this strategic shift. And what has given us the possibility is that, first, the silver lining in the very dark cloud of that nuclear deal with Iran, the empowering of Iran, was to bring Israel and the Arab world together. That's one. Second is the Arab states, the leadership, they're not just concerned about the empowering of Shia fanaticism, they're concerned about the empowering of Sunni fanaticism. And so Al-Qaeda was 1.0, ISIS is 2.0, but they know there's going to be a 3.0. And the third factor was the perception in the region that has not changed between President Obama and President Trump that the U.S. is leaving, that U.S. is withdrawing from the region. So if you think about it, you know, they're seeing this Iranian tiger and this ISIS or whatever comes next leopard, and then they see the 800-pound gorilla that is leaving the building. So they look around and they see a 250-pound gorilla with a kippah on, and they say, you know what, maybe we'll work with you. That's one. The second thing that's important, Israel is a global technological power. We need to internalize it. Israel is a global technological power. And if you think about it, if there are leaders in the Arab world, and I think there are, who want to catapult their countries forward a couple of centuries, then to boycott Israel, that's like Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and half of Southern California boycotting Silicon Valley. It makes no sense. They have a center of world innovation literally next door. But the problem that they have is they've been poisoning their populations for 70 years against Israel. So they can't just surface this and move. If they could wave a magic wand, they would tomorrow. And part of, I think, the creativity that is necessary in any plan is to seize this moment and to put something down that maybe we would not reject and that the Arab states would not reject. That, to me, is the bar that they have to cross. It may not be that both will embrace. It won't be, written by Israel. It's not written by them. It's a U.S. plan, and hopefully it'll be something that neither of us have to reject. And that will be the first time in history that the U.S. has put down a plan that would have achieved that result. Most of the time, both sides reject. Sometimes Israel accepts and they reject. But if the Arab states, the Palestinians are a separate issue. But I think that gives us an opportunity with the Gulf states. And now get to the UN issue. And we have our great UN ambassador here who can correct me. When I talk about the UN, it feels like I'm giving a Dvar Torah in front of a rabbi when I talk in front of Ron Pastor. But
It depends which rabbi.
Israel's standing at the UN is fundamentally changing. And the change may happen much faster than people think. And the reason why is because we are a rising power. The reason why all these countries, India, China, Japan, Russia, Africa, Latin America, Brazil, all these countries are moving towards Israel is because they see Israel as a potential partner for them in security and technology. And as Israel rises as a power, their interests are about actually voting with Israel. It's not that all of a sudden a wave of Zionism has swept through the world. It's one of the reasons why the BDS movement I don't see as an economic threat to Israel. If everyone were investing in Israel and trading with Israel because they were Zionists, it would be an economic threat. But the reason why all these technology companies are in Israel is not because they're Zionists. It's because they want access to the best minds in the world, some of them at least, and to make the best products to help their companies. And so BDS is a moral threat, and we should defend ourselves against this attempt to turn Israel into a pariah nation. But what's happening at the UN is that you have the interests of these countries rising, understanding more and more that Israel is actually as a partner, and you're beginning to see a slow shift in their votes. What we needed for a long time was a tailwind from Washington. And we got a tailwind the last couple of years. Her name was Hurricane Haley. And she did a great job, and you can see cracks emerging. She had a vote there. You would think would be a no-brainer. One of these world is flat, condemn Hamas votes at the UN, but they made it so that you'd have to get a supermajority. But you can see the beginning of the change. You can see on votes, instead of getting 3 or 8, it'll be 20. And then maybe next year it'll be 35. And next year it'll be 70. We can crack the automatic majorities against Israel at the UN. And the way that we will crack it is not necessarily, we have to do this anyway, to make the better arguments, to explain to them what is happening in our conflict with the Palestinians. It's to make Israel very strong and very powerful and a country that they need. If it's a country that they need, you will see the shift in their votes. And I have great confidence that Israel is going to continue its rise as an economic power, as a technological power, as a security power, military, intelligence. And as long as we continue on that trajectory, you will begin to see this automatic majority against Israel at the UN collapse.
Okay, we have a problem with time. So, quick questions. I also want, if there are any students in the room. Okay, here is a high school student that represents part of our future. Michael, come up here to this young man, please. This is a rising senior in high school. He represents our future. He'll be on the front lines.
Rising power at AJC.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris.
And he's the only person I know who calls me Mr. Harris.
So I'll keep the question brief because we're low on time. So recently, some, including Trump advisor John Bolton, have argued that regime change in Iran is the most effective way to protect American and Israeli interests and achieve peace. Do you believe that regime change, negotiated peace with the current government, or another solution is the best long-term solution to Iran?
Thanks, Dave. Okay, let's pick a couple of questions. Short, please.
Okay, hi, I'm Daniel from Mexico.
From Mexico.
And my question will be, we've seen in the past that when Israel stayed at Lebanon, it wasn't the best thing in the 1980s.
When Israel what?
Stayed
in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what should be made different now in the West Bank, and how the security should be managed in the border, so it will be well managed?
I think in a way, if I may, Ron, you answer the question by saying you cannot give up security control, not now, not ever, which is fundamentally different than southern Lebanon. But Ron may have others. You pick the others, if you would. And Jillian, you'll tell us when we... Last question?
They run a tight ship here.
So, Jim Kaufman from Boston. With Iran's ascendancy in Syria and American withdrawal, do you see relations with Russia as a possible answer? And what is the state of relations between Israel and Russia?
Okay, you're going to slip in just one last question to hear at least what it is. Can we pick a female?
Hi.
Thank you.
Michelle King from Washington, D.C. What's the one thing that the 400 activists in this room can do to support Israel, both on social media and beyond?
Okay. I'm sorry about the other questions.
Okay. So first one was about the whole issue of regime change. I haven't heard Ambassador Bolton say that since he went into the administration. That may have been his personal view before, but he doesn't, as he's mentioned many times, he doesn't set the policy. That's the policy of the president. And we haven't heard the United States say that their policy is regime change in Iran. What they say is they want to change the behavior of Iran. What I think is the only way that you're going to get Iran to change its behavior, and for me the most important thing is they have to give up their military nuclear capability completely. We have to actually resolve that problem. It may not resolve all the problems with Iran, but at least we will have taken the one existential threat to the state of Israel, the one threat to our very survival, off the table. The only way they're going to do that is if their regime actually is threatened with collapse. They're not going to give it up unless their regime is threatened with collapse. And from my point of view, it's either a dramatic change in behavior of the Iranian regime or that the regime, collapses. I think what we should recognize is that we do have partners in Iran. They're the Iranian people. And they suffer under this regime for 40 years. I think they hate them. And it takes tremendous courage in Iran to come out and for women to take off their headdresses, for dissidents to go. And you see them protesting in Iran. And there was that moment in 2009. I don't know what would have happened or could have happened. But they hate this regime. I don't think they're anti-American. They're probably the third most pro-American people in the Middle East. Israel's one by far. The Kurds are very pro-American, and probably the Iranian people. And we had relations with Iran before, and I can see us having good relations with Iran again. And I can see after this regime, I could see them having good relations, also very good relations with the United States. And we know from our own history as Jews that Persian civilization was a fairly tolerant, I got to put it in perspective. What are you comparing it to? Nothing compares to the United States and how Jews have been treated in the United States. But maybe a distant second is Persian civilization. If you could choose for most of the centuries whether you were going to live in Persia or Iran or live somewhere in Europe, take this last 75 years out, you would have chosen to live in Iran as a Jew because it was an open and tolerant society because of their traditions and their more pluralistic society. So I do think you have partners, and I think the combination has to be crippling sanctions. It has to be a credible military threat if they would ever seek to break out to nuclear weapons. They have to understand that no one is going to accept that, neither Israel nor the United States, and really consistent outreach to the Iranian people, which I really think are your partners. The other question is about, you asked me about Russia and our relations there. So what we have had to do, our strategy in Syria is basically to get to a point where Iran throws in the towel. And they realize that the costs of what they're doing in Syria are simply not worth it. And that strategy really relies on three legs. One is tremendous American economic pressure, so check that. The second thing was Israel taking action to prevent Iran from establishing this permanent military these bases against Israel in Syria to launch attacks against us. And we've had to attack well over a couple hundred times, including very, very recently. And the third thing was that the U.S. had forces that were basically serving as almost a bone in the throat of an Iran effort to get from Iran through Iraq, through Syria and Lebanon to the Mediterranean. And those three things together have created a situation where Iran is thinking more and more whether or not this is truly worth it. And what we want to see in Syria is very simple. You sit 100 Israelis in this chair, you ask them what they want to see in Syria, you'll get 105 different answers. But if you ask them what they don't want to see is we don't want to see Iran there. We want Iran out. And the way we think to get Iran out is to have some sort of agreement between the U.S. and Russia. And we've been encouraging that from some time. It's actually been a number of years already, hopefully to find a political solution with one request: get Iran out. And the good news is in 3 weeks, Israel will be hosting the National Security Advisor of the United States, the National Security Advisor of Russia in Jerusalem to try to discuss this and other regional issues. And I think that speaks volumes also about Israel's rise as a power in the world, that we are hosting such a summit, and we're not just giving a hotel room, we're part of those discussions. The last thing is what can the AJC do? It's, I think, be very well informed, which in my experience you are. Be very thoughtful, as you say, and I think that process, I give credit to the AJC, because at the end of the day, whether it took you 23 days or 15 days, or 5 days, or 30 days. At the end of the day, history will show that the AJC stood against the nuclear deal with Iran. And I give you great credit for taking that stand. But I think you have to be very informed, which you are. You have to engage with all of the people, both in this country and around the world. As I said, as Israel's rising as a power, opportunities exist today for cooperation that were not there before because we have something to offer. This is not the Israel of 50 years ago or 25 years ago. We're a rising power. And I think the more you learn about what Israel can offer, the more you use all your contacts with people to strengthen our relations with those countries, you will see many, many breakthroughs happening. And an organization that has a very broad footprint, that has the diplomatic reach that the AJC has, is a tremendous partner in helping, I think, to secure the future of Israel. So thank you for everything you have done and that you will do.